morning. By way of introduction, my name is Jeannie Mancini. I have the honor of being the president of the March for Life Education and Defense Fund, and I am beyond happy to welcome all of you here at this point now to our conference this morning. So we officially kick off the March for Life 2016 events as we begin this morning. So I want to give just a brief overview of our morning, of our conference, and also to explain that we see the March for Life as an opportunity to educate the culture, both people that are with us on the life issues and those who might be a little bit more questioning about the life issues. So we choose our theme with the eye to what is the most important thing to educate about in this moment in time. And so the conference then is an opportunity to delve into that a little bit more. Tomorrow at the rally, either the courageous, firm souls who will be at the rally and marching with us in this snowstorm, or those who will be watching on TV, will be able to see and hear a little bit more about our theme. But they'll be hearing 2-minute sound bites from some really, really remarkable people. It will be very exciting. Today, however, we get to go deep. Today is a moment to really go deep and to hear about this beautiful, beautiful theme. Pro-life and pro-woman go hand in hand. As we know, we hear very often that in order to be pro-woman, you need to be pro-choice. Nothing could be further from the truth. And so we're going to hear firsthand this morning from a really remarkable woman, Sue Browder, about her own experience of why that's not the case, as well as some really interesting historical facts and stories along the way these last 40, 45 years. So we're really excited for that. That will be our first hour this morning. We'll follow that with a really outstanding panel of women who are living out this theme in a beautiful, different way in each of their lives. And each of them are living very different states in life and have a beautiful message to share with you. So that will be the second hour. And then our last hour is taking that theme and bringing it to Congress. So we'll hear, as you know, when marchers are invited to Washington, D.C., an important component of that is finish the march by going to your member's office, whether they're pro-life or whether they're not with us on the issue. Your voice with your member is very important with your elected officials. And so for our last hour this morning, we're going to be given really practical nuts and bolts about how to talk to our legislators on this incredibly important issue. How to take the beautiful theme of pro-life and pro-woman go hand in hand to Congress and to make them enact great legislation that really embodies our theme. So you're in for a real treat for the next few hours, and as you know, we've got coffee and yummy snacks outside, so please feel free to get up as needed. But without further ado, I'd like to introduce you to Sue Browder, who is just an incredibly special woman. Just getting away from her bio for one moment, I'll mention that I had the opportunity to read an advanced copy of Subverted, her book, this summer. And well, first of all, I said I can't read it because I'm too busy. I had a lot going on. And then I started to read it and I couldn't put it down, and I was done in a matter of 2 days because it was that incredible and that gripping. And I hope that any of you who haven't had a chance to read it will absolutely do so after you hear her story, because she's just a beautiful woman with an incredible story, and you'll soon hear that. And she has quite a background as well, quite a beautiful background in terms of being a writer that God has used to make a profound influence. So Sue Browder is a freelance writer who's appeared on Oprah, The Today Show, and hundreds of radio talk shows. Her work for Cosmopolitan, New Woman, Woman's Day, and other magazines has given her a lifetime of experience with the women's movement as it has unfolded in the media, both on the public stage and behind the scenes. Trained at the University of Missouri School of Journalism to be an investigative journalist, Browder unwittingly betrayed her true calling and became a propagandist for the sexual liberation. She did not realize until much later that propagandists higher and cleverer than herself were influencing her thinking and her personal choices as they subverted the women's movement. Her most recent book, Subverted, How I Helped the Sexual Revolution Hijack the Women's Movement, sets the record straight and illumines a way forward for others who've suffered from the unholy alliance between the women's movement and the sexual revolution. I introduce you to Sue Ellen Browder.
Thank you so much for that beautiful introduction. And I feel deeply humbled and honored to be here because, as you know, for most of my life, I was on the pro-abortion side of the fence. And while writing for Cosmopolitan magazine from the early 1970s through most of the 80s, I promoted the Cosmo Girl lifestyle with the philosophy that hard work and sex without the kids will set you free. The first pro-life event I attended was the Walk for Life in 2009 in San Francisco. I went with a friend of mine who had had 3 abortions, and she had been infertile because of it, and she had gone to the march to be silent no more. And I was there to give her moral support, and as I was standing there in front of the Silent No More platform, Father Frank Pabone was standing there above me, and he looked right at me and he said, "What are you going to do?" And this book, Subverted, is my answer to Father Frank. There are 2 stories in this book. One is my story, how I went from being a writer for Cosmopolitan magazine to becoming a Catholic. The other is your story. Today I want to focus on your story, because that's the story that's been forgotten. And if you don't tell this story, nobody will. When I was sitting at my little blue desk at Cosmopolitan in the early 1970s, I had come to New York from Midwest, and I got a job at Cosmopolitan. I worked for Helen Gurley Brown, and there was something that was very obvious to me in those days that has now been forgotten. In those days, the sexual revolution and the women's movement were 2 dramatically different movements. Although Helen Gurley Brown would have loved for her magazine, her Sex Revolution magazine, to be part of the women's movement, Betty Friedan, who had founded the women's movement with her, launched it really, with her book, The Feminine Mystique in 1963, called Cosmo, quite obscene and quite horrible. So how do we get to the point where so many young women today believe that to be free is to go to college, get a great degree, have a fantastic job, and be as sexually free as possible with no strings attached? How did those 2, once radically separate movements, become joined together? Well, that's what this book tells you. That's the backstory in this book, or maybe the forward front story. So there's 2 stories here about my life and my love with my beautiful husband and all of that. And then there's this story that I'm going to tell you. This is the story that didn't make the news that didn't make the news about the women's movement. And it took me 5 years of hard investigative research to find it. This story has been buried for nearly 50 years, much of it in libraries and out-of-print books. And I realized that if I didn't tell this story, it could be lost and forgotten forever. I think this story could help reframe the abortion debate in our nation. The HH mandate, the fight for religious freedom, so many battles that we're fighting over sex and abortion in our nation today spring, at least in part, from the confusion, or perhaps I should say the false fusion, between the women's movement's unifying demands for education and equality in education and the workforce, and the sexual revolution's divisive demands for abortion and contraception. So you've got 2, the women's movement in the beginning was very unifying. The sexual revolution is what has made this so divisive. It is my hope that the new facts I unearthed while researching this book can begin to help heal our abortion-wounded nation. When Betty launched the women's movement, the second wave feminist women's movement in 1963 with The Feminine Mystique, her book did not even mention abortion or contraception. On the contrary, Betty Friedan firmly defended a woman's right to be a mother. 30 years after she launched the women's movement, Betty had an interview with Playboy magazine, and she said, to Playboy, "Women are the people who give birth to children, and that is a necessary value in society. You want a feminism that includes women who have children and want children, because that's the majority of women." I'm here to tell you that you are the new family feminists of the 21st century, and you are also the family feminists that launched second wave feminism in the 1960s. This movement of ours has been hijacked, and we're going to talk about how it happened. As late as the year 2000, Betty wrote, "Ideologically, I was never for abortion. Motherhood is a value to me, and even today, abortion is not. I believed passionately in 1967, as I do today, that women should have the right of chosen motherhood. For me, the matter of choice," this is Betty Friedan, the leading feminist of the 1960s, "for me, the matter of choice has never been primarily the choice of abortion, but that you can choose to be a mother. That is as important as any right written into the Constitution." The family feminist movement, as Betty initially envisioned it when she started in 1963, was very unifying for women. Women of my generation were entering the workforce in droves, and we were encountering a lot of surprising injustice. Women were fired for being pregnant. I was fired in 1969 for being pregnant. I was told that I could only work for 5 months and then I would have to leave my job with no promise of having a job when I returned. Classified ads in newspapers were divided into help wanted male ads, all the good jobs, and help wanted female ads, all the low-paying jobs, cleaning women. A married woman couldn't apply for credit in her own name. People have forgotten this. Many law schools and medical schools were closed to women. In some states, women couldn't serve on juries. So there was a lot of stuff going on, and working women were quite unified in wanting to put a stop to this. But the sexual revolution, when I went to work at Cosmo in the early 70s, and I worked there as a freelance writer for the next almost 20 years, was an entirely different matter. Helen Gurley Brown had a favorite slogan that she kept on a little pillow. It was embroidered on a little pillow in her office. And it said, "Good girls go to heaven, bad girls go everywhere." At Cosmo, we turned all traditional values upside down. It was good to sleep with a married man, good to take the pill, good or at least necessary to have an abortion to get ahead. The sexual revolution was built largely on propaganda. Now, most people don't understand what propaganda is. They think it's just a bunch of lies. No, propaganda is half-truth, selected truth, and truth out of context. Propaganda can be 90% true. It's the 10% that gets you. At Cosmo, we split sex from love. It's a very divisive movement. We split sex from love. We split sex from marriage. We split sex from babies. We split women from men by advocating divorce. Helen taught that hard work and sex without the kids will set you free. That last part is very important. Freedom depended on not having children. As I say, Helen Gurley Brown would have loved for the Cosmo to be considered part of the women's movement, but Betty Friedan called Cosmo quite obscene and quite horrible. She said a view of liberation that turns a woman into a sex object, as we were doing at Cosmo, is a false freedom that denies a woman's full personhood. And Betty said a woman's freedom to express her full personhood in all areas of society was what the women's movement is all about. That personhood is going to come back. We're going to talk about this quite a bit as we go along, so kind of follow that thread as we go through this. Betty was following in the footsteps of Alice Paul and other pro-life feminists who fought to give women the right to vote. Alice Paul, a Quaker, called abortion the ultimate exploitation of women. Other suffragists who opposed abortion included Susan B. Anthony, Dr. Elizabeth Blackwell, and Elizabeth Cady Stanton. Although I had no strong opinions about abortion when I was working at Cosmo in 1971, I was already married, happily married, and had a child. But I agreed with Betty Friedan that the Cosmo Girl lifestyle, which I was writing for, but you have to remember I was an ambitious young journalist. Cosmo was the hottest women's magazine in the nation. I was very curious about glamour because I come from a small town in Iowa. My daddy owned a shoe store. And so I was fascinated with this glamorous lifestyle in New York City. But as I was there, I agreed with Betty Friedan that the Cosmo lifestyle betrayed women. I was happily married, as I say, and I certainly didn't want to be a single mother with no means of support. No thank you. Without articulating it, I intuitively knew what I now know very firmly now, that a woman is strongest, happiest, and most empowered, not when she's left isolated and alone, but when she's interconnected in a strong bond of love with others. When my beloved husband Walter and I left New York City with our baby and moved to Los Angeles and then to Connecticut, I continued to write sex revolution propaganda for Cosmo to earn money for the next 2 decades. But meanwhile, I was working at home with my wonderful husband and our 2 children, baking homemade cookies and homemade breads, planting vegetable gardens, and living this idyllic life in the country. By the way, Helen Gurley Brown was married to the same man for over 50 years, and she who said that if David ever had an affair, she'd kill him. Okay? How was I able to live such a double life without feeling guilty? On some level, my conscience was nagging me. I was often anxious, stressed, and depressed, but didn't know why. I didn't like to write. Every time I'd sit down, I'd go, I don't like writing. Well, I didn't like writing those lies I was telling. But for many years, I told myself that the sex revolution propaganda I wrote for Cosmo didn't really hurt anyone. I now know that the most dangerous lies we tell are the ones we tell ourselves. It was only later, after I was received into the Catholic Church at age 57, that I began to see what terrible damage all the sex revolution lies I told at Cosmo had done to women, men, babies, and families. So on the one hand, I told myself the sexual revolution lifestyle and the divisive view of a woman's personhood we were selling at Cosmo were not for me. Yet on the other hand, I believed 100% in the women's movement as Betty Friedan had originally framed it. What I didn't know was behind the scenes, even before we'd arrived in New York City, the sex revolution's false and extremely divisive view of a woman's personhood, the delusion that splitting sex from men, marriage, and children empowers women, the delusion on which Roe v. Wade is based, by the way, had already been inserted into the women's movement, largely due to the efforts of one man I had never even heard of, a master propagandist named Larry Lader. Anybody heard of him? Ah, some people have. Yes, because he was the co-founder with Dr. Bernard Nathanson of the National Abortion Rights Action League, originally the National Association to Repeal Abortion Laws, and now NARAL, Pro-Choice America. Okay, Larry was a very successful magazine writer in New York City. He was a Harvard grad, he'd been born Jewish, but he was an atheist, and he was an ardent propagation planner. His greatest passion was to make abortion legal. He was good friends with Betty Friedan, and he was also the biographer of Planned Parenthood founder Margaret Sanger. He called Margaret Sanger the greatest influence in his life. Later had borrowed his view of human personhood from Sanger, and it went something like this: there is no God, therefore I am not interconnected with everyone and everything. Therefore, what I say, think, and do, privately and alone behind closed doors, is all about me and nobody else. It's my life. I can do whatever I please, and my rights are at war with everyone else's rights. In Larry Lader's view, a pregnant woman's rights were at war with the rights of her baby. Lader wanted to legalize abortion because he thought there were too many people in the world, and because he knew Sanger so well, he had the feminist rhetoric down pat. He called pregnancy, and this is a quote, the ultimate punishment for sex. And he wrote, "The complete legalization of abortion is the one just and inevitable answer to the quest for feminine freedom." This is Larry Lader's book of propaganda, which is now out of print. But this is a very important book because it actually became the template for Roe v. Wade, the arguments in Roe v. Wade, and we'll get to that in a minute. Lader was extremely crafty. He knew most Americans at the time were against abortion, and if he wanted to legalize abortion in America, he had to, as he told Bernard Nathanson, recruit the feminists. Unfortunately, he managed to do just that. We may never know exactly what he said to Betty Friedan, that woman who wanted to be who had 3 children and said a woman's right to be a mother was as important as any right in the Constitution. We don't know what exactly he said to her. Maybe one day we'll know. But it appears that 6 weeks after he told Bernard Nathanson that they needed to recruit the feminists, Betty Friedan, who had resisted him for years on this, stood up in the second national conference for the National Organization for Women and demanded that abortion be inserted as a right into the National Organization for Women's Bill of Rights. And we know when it happened, and it took me many looks to find this. It probably took me a total of 2 years off and on to find out how this meeting took place. And this meeting is a very interesting meeting that happened, and it's reported in my book, A Fly on the Wall of the Chinese Room. It tells exactly what happened. We can't get into all the details here, but I'll give you the highlights, okay? So on Saturday night, November 18th, 1967, in the Chinese room of the Mayflower Hotel right here in D.C., the National Organization for Women had met to draw up its political Bill of Rights. No reporter was present. It was a closed-door meeting. No reporter was present to witness what happened. Only about 100 people were there. Betty sprang abortion on them. Well, most of them didn't know she was going to do it. Especially the leaders of the National Organization, some of the founders of the National Organization for Women didn't even know she was going to spring abortion on them. She sprang abortion on them at the last thing. It was on that Saturday night. It was extremely, it was an uproar. They fought till almost midnight over it. A bunch of women walked out. And finally, and only 100 people were there, only 57 people that night voted to insert abortion, contraception, and sex education into the Women's Movement's Bill of Rights. That is the only right that we are still fighting over today. There were only 8 rights in that Bill of Rights. 2 of them they fought over. One was the Equal Rights Amendment, which we no longer have. The other was abortion. Many of those now members, I've even read somewhere that it's 1/3 of those now members, walked out that night and later resigned from the National Organization for Women over the abortion vote. The other rights are things that we would all agree on. You know, a woman has a right not to be subjected to sex discrimination in employment, rights to paid maternity leave, child care, rights for parents to deduct home and child care expenses from their income taxes. They were asking for child care centers. It's the right of poor women to secure job training. So the only right in the National Organization's Bill of Rights that we're still fighting over today is that right number 8, that snake in the grass. And that is because it was inserted through deception and deceit. At that very hour, shortly before midnight on November 18th, 1967, in the Chinese room, when the abortion contraception demand was inserted into now's Bill of Rights, the once united women's movement split into two factions: feminists who were for abortion and feminists who opposed it. On Monday morning, Betty held a press conference and handed out a press release in which she claimed to be speaking for, and this is a quote from her press release, 28 million American working women, the millions of women emerging from our colleges each year who are intent on full participation in the mainstream of our society, and mothers who are emerging from their homes to go back to work. Basically, she claimed to be speaking for all working women in America, when in fact, she was speaking for only 57 people in the Chinese room. And that, my friends, is how propaganda works. The next day, the Washington Post wasn't there, runs a story headlining the abortion vote and reporting, "Now supports the furthering of the sexual revolution of our century." Listen to this. "Now supports the furthering of the sexual revolution of our century by pressing for widespread sex education and provision of birth control information and contraceptives, and by urging that all laws penalizing abortion be repealed." And that's how the 1960s women's movement, which started out as a unified family feminist movement for working women and mothers, was subverted and became a vehicle for abortion. How I found this was that one little seed, that one little mustard seed. I knew that those two were separate movements at one time. I became very curious about how that happened. And as I say, it took me 5 years to find out, but I finally did. Okay? Over the next several years, as the media repeatedly told the subverted story, more and more Americans bought into the illusion that abortion was a right all truly liberated women had always wanted and needed to be free. One American who bought into this illusion was U.S. Supreme Court Justice Harry Blackmun, who wrote the Roe v. Wade and Doe v. Bolton decisions. And we'll get back to Blackmun's story in just a minute. But first, let's talk about one pro-life feminist in the Chinese room who didn't buy into the abortion lie. And that was Ohio attorney Betty Boyer. She was furious over the abortion vote. She said a human life is a sacred trust. She was one of the founders of NOW. She later resigned from the NOW board after what she described as a shouting match and went back to Ohio, where she founded the pro-life Women's Equity Action League, WEAL. Anybody heard of it? No, we haven't heard of it. Until I started researching this book, I hadn't heard of it either. Although WEAL's membership never exceeded 10,000, its leverage through an active presence in this city of DC was impressive. They had a lot of lawyers in their court. The pro-life feminists who joined Betty Boyer at WEAL opened academia up to women, forced newspapers to stop running health-wanted male and health-wanted female ads. Pro-life feminists at WEAL also lobbied to get the Pregnancy Discrimination Act of 1978 passed, which made it illegal for a woman to be fired for being pregnant. WEAL also worked to get women's sports programs in high schools and colleges. I'm not saying WEAL won all these victories single-handedly. They worked with other groups on the same issues. But I do think it's safe to say that pro-life feminists did a huge chunk of the work, and pro-abortion feminists took most of the credit. Now, there is one reason why that was partly true, and I spoke to Betty Boyer's niece, who's still alive, and she said they didn't want the credit too much in those days, and the National Organization for Women did, so they just let them have it. They didn't want that attention because they could lose their jobs. They were doing this wacky stuff for women. So they just let the pro-abortionists have the center stage. Okay, now comes along U.S. Supreme Court Harry Blackmun. Justice Harry Blackmun, a good, solid Republican, faithful husband, these are by all accounts, family man with 3 grown daughters. Chief Justice Warren Burger assigns Harry the task of writing the Roe v. Wade and Doe v. Bolton abortion decisions. Harry is by far the slowest writer on the court. He's hardly ever thought about abortion, and he doesn't have a clue what women want. One night, shortly after being assigned to write the abortion opinions, he's at home having dinner with his wife and 3 daughters, and he asks all the women around his table what they think of abortion. He gets 4 different answers. He puts down his fork in mid-bite, pushes back his chair, and says, "I think I'll go lie down. I'm getting a headache." Well, Harry slaves away at writing his abortion opinions, but it's not going well. He circulates his opinions. His liberal colleagues on the court slam him. He withdraws his draft from consideration and vows to try again. Finally, he goes out, and again, this is all reported in the book and all documented, by the way. I've been to the Library of Congress. I've read the Blackmun papers. Everything in here is footnoted. Okay, Harry's having troubles. He goes out to the Mayo Clinic in his home state of Minnesota over the summer of '72, and he leaves behind his $15,000 a year, 28-year-old law clerk, George Frampton Jr., who stays back in D.C. to help Harry draft the opinions. Unlike Harry, George is an excellent writer. He was a managing editor of Harvard Law Review when he was in college. In D.C., George comes upon a very interesting book. It was written by Larry Lader, and it's a masterpiece of propaganda. The inside dust jacket reads, "Larry Lader has written an angry book, but a book completely informed and documented, a book to change the attitudes and laws of a nation." Unfortunately, as I've told you, this completely informed and documented book is laced with poisonous half-truth, selected truth, and truth out of context about abortion history, theology, and the history of the Catholic Church. Much of the bogus history in this book, because Larry Lader was very anti-Catholic, and his enemy in this battle was the Catholic hierarchy. He said they were the greatest, what did he say? Threat to Western civilization. Okay. Much of the bogus history in this book was invented by Cyril Chestnut Means. He was a NARAL attorney. The history Means told was so complex and convoluted that it has taken Villanova University law history professor Joseph Della Pena 1,283 pages in his book, Dispelling the Myths of Abortion History, to sort out all the abortion lies that entered our culture through the fabrications of Means and Lader. So they were in cahoots, Means and Lader. But perhaps even more important than the bogus history in this book is the view of personhood that underlies Lader's arguments. I am not interconnected with everything and everyone. I am freest when I stand alone, and what I do is all about me. When Harry Blackmun accepted Larry Lader, a mere magazine writer, he was just a magazine writer, as a reliable authority on abortion history, philosophy, and theology, when he used this book as the very foundation for the writing of his history section of Roe v. Wade, he became as a blind man following a blind guide. Later set himself up as an authority on centuries of abortion legal history and also on 2 millennia of Catholic teachings about abortion. And Blackmun and his clerk fell for the ruse. When I came here and looked at the Blackmun papers in the Library of Congress, and I saw what had happened, because I was trying to figure out when did this book get inserted into those opinions? When did it happen? Well, it happened that summer when Harry was at Mayo, and it happened when his clerk drafted the history. His clerk was the one that found this book. He probably didn't know any better. He was a young man. But it was very, when I saw that, I had a friend with me, Liz had come with me from California, and I said, Liz, I can't believe this. I cannot believe that this clerk, and it took me a long time. It probably took me 2 weeks of looking at those papers and looking at those papers and looking at those papers right before I said, no, he didn't. That's what happened. And there are other people that have noticed it too. David Garrow, who is a historian, who is a pro-abortion historian, said that Harry's letting his clerks do as much work as they did on the opinions, Garrow called indefensible. He said it's clear that the clerks made significant contributions to Roe v. Wade and Doe v. Bolton. Okay, in the end, Harry's Roe v. Wade opinion, Larry's masterpiece of propaganda, is cited 7 times, and Cyril Chestnut Means' bogus legal history papers are cited another 7 times. So what do the scholars think of all this? Well, you know, scholars on both the right and the left, pro-abortionists and pro-lifers alike, have all said Roe v. Wade is very peculiar. Virtually every aspect of the historical, sociological, medical, and legal arguments used to support the Roe holdings have been subjected to intense scholarly criticism. In Harvard Law Review, Harvard Law professor Lawrence Tribe wrote, "One of the most curious things about Roe is that behind its own verbal smokescreen, the substantive judgment on which it rests is nowhere to be found." Yes, it is. It's right here. So let's look at this story one more time and recap what we've seen here. What actually happened, what could it mean, and what can we do? First and foremost, of course, we must silence our hearts, pray, and listen. We cannot do this alone because we are not alone. God is with us. First, learn to pray, a monk once told me, then you will easily perform all your other good works. Secondly, as the pro-life branch of the feminist movement, we must reclaim our true history, which has long been suppressed. We must not be afraid. If only a handful of sexual radicals gave us Roe v. Wade, all of us marching hand in hand with the mothers of America can bring it down. We need to name, claim, and proclaim that it is pro-life family feminists, not Planned Parenthood, not NARAL, who speak in one unified voice for the dignity and respect of all women and girls around the world. And it is pro-life family feminism that represents the genuine, authentic women's movement of the 21st century. The early suffragists, like Alice Paul, were pro-life. Your branch of the women's movement, pro-life family feminism, is the branch of the women's movement that gave women the right to vote. Your branch of the women's movement, pro-life family feminism, is the branch of the women's movement that launched second-wave feminism before it was hijacked by pro-abortionists in the Chinese Room in 1967 and again by Roe v. Wade in 1973. Your branch of the women's movement, pro-life family feminism, is the feminist tradition embraced by Betty Boyer and Wheel. It is the branch of the women's movement that opened up academia to women, forced newspapers to stop running help-wanted male and help-wanted female ads, fought for school sports programs in high schools and colleges, and kept women from being fired for being pregnant by lobbying for the passage of the Pregnancy Discrimination Act of 1978. By 1979, the National Organization for Women had 100,000 members, and by the late 1970s, the National Right to Life Committee, representing your grassroots pro-life women's movement, had 110 times that many, 11 million members. True political power doesn't come from the top down. It grows from the ground up. The pro-life family feminist movement has had the interconnected grassroots power. We had it in 1979, and we continue to have that interconnected grassroots power today. In 1980, by 1980, even Betty Friedan herself declared that the women's movement, as it had been conceived in the Chinese room, had come to a dead end. That was her word. And why? She said, our blind spot was the family. John Paul II called on women to create a new feminism. And I would suggest that you are already doing that. Because Betty was very firm about how the feminist movement needed men to be part of it too. This was not feminist movement was just not all about women. It was about men, it was about babies, it was about justice. So John Paul II called us to create a new feminism, and I would suggest you are already doing that. The pro-life movement is not some little backwater conservative backlash against real feminism represented by the likes of Planned Parenthood, as the media so often imply. Pro-life family feminism began in the 19th century, continued through the 20th century, and you are still here, an army of love, hundreds of thousands strong, marching in the streets to make your voices heard. Pro-life feminists have been here in America for over 200 years, and we are not going away. So first, we have to pray. Second, we need to reclaim our history. Third, I think we need to recognize that at the heart of the battle over abortion lies a deeper war that we're fighting in our nation today, and that's the war over a woman's personhood. Are a woman and her baby radically separate, totally independent individuals whose rights are at war with each other? The view of personhood advocated by Margaret Sanger, Larry Lader, and implicitly enshrined in Roe v. Wade? Or are a woman and her baby a unity of two persons? That was John Paul II's words. Unity of two persons, interconnected in love with everyone and everything. Well, we know the answer to that one, don't we? Whatever harms the baby harms the mother. Whatever harms the mother harms the baby. And whatever harms either of them harms us all. When we as Americans pledge that we are one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all, we are declaring the truth that we are all interconnected, that we believe in liberty and justice for even the smallest person in the womb, and that we cannot pit one human's rights against another human's rights. Human rights are indivisible. We need to bring this battle over a woman's true personhood into the light and begin talking about the truth of our interconnectedness in this nation. Human rights are not isolated, private, and at war with each other. Human rights are indivisible. To be pro-life is to be pro-woman, and to be pro-woman is to be pro-life. And this has been true for 200 years. So let us, as one living body, interconnected in love, keep up the good fight until every man, woman, and child in this nation is at last free from the chains of the sexual revolution, until unity and justice once again reign over this land, and we bring down Roe v. Wade. They've got this book, a few limited, well, not a few, more than a few, limited number of signed copies, and you can come over and get a copy. But we've got to spread this word. We've got to spread the word.
unity of two and so many different deep, almost sound bites that I think probably all of us could ponder Sue Ellen's words for, for a year, basically, about how important and how true they are. So thank you so much. And I can tell that everybody was listening intently. There were some March for Life staff people whispering in the back about logistics, and they got some dirty looks because people really wanted to hear everything, and they were on her every word. So thank you, Sue Ellen, thank you. And you're actually going to get to hear a little bit more of a personal story from Sue Ellen in the next portion with the panel. So what we're going to do right now is just take about a 5-minute break, so go refill your coffee, get a little snack, and then we're going to reconvene for the panel portion.